The cowboy aided the chief, yet 300 warriors closed in, threatening everything. The sun was still low over the wide open land when the cowboy rode alone across the plains. The grass moved gently with the wind, and the sky stretched so far that it made a man feel small. He had been on the trail for weeks, guiding a small group of cattle earlier, but now he was traveling by himself. His horse knew the rhythm of the land, stepping carefully over dry ground and shallow streams. The cowboy was not a man who talked much. He preferred the quiet, where thoughts could come and go without being spoken. He was known among other riders as someone who kept to himself. He did his work, got paid fairly, and moved on. Trouble followed loud men, not quiet ones, or so he believed. He stayed away from towns unless he needed supplies, and he never stayed long enough to be remembered. Life on the range had taught him that memory could be both a gift and a burden. The land he crossed that morning was not clearly owned by anyone. Some said it belonged to settlers. Others said it had always belonged to the native people who had lived there long before fences or maps existed. The cowboy did not claim to know the truth. To him, the land was simply land, hard, beautiful, and unforgiving. But he knew enough to stay alert. This was a place where misunderstandings could turn serious very quickly. As the sun climbed higher, the heat began to press down. The cowboy pulled his hat lower and slowed his horse near a line of low hills. He planned to rest briefly, give the horse water, and move on before nightfall. Night could be dangerous in unfamiliar territory. Sounds traveled farther and shadows played tricks on the eyes. As he guided his horse toward a small stream, something caught his attention. The birds had gone quiet. The air felt still in a way that made his senses sharpen. He dismounted and tied his horse to a nearby tree, moving slowly, carefully. Years on the range had taught him to trust these feelings. Near the stream, partly hidden by tall grass and rocks, he saw a figure lying on the ground. At first he froze. His hand moved close to his side, not reaching for trouble but ready in case trouble found him. He studied the scene before stepping closer. The man on the ground was older, dressed differently from the settlers the cowboy knew. His clothing showed signs of long travel and leadership, not wealth but respect. His face was marked by age and experience. He was breathing but barely, and his movements were slow. It was clear he had been through something difficult and had little strength left. The cowboy stood there for a long moment thinking. He knew who this man likely was, a tribal chief, or at least someone important. Helping him could bring serious consequences. If others saw the cowboy aiding him, they might assume sides had been chosen. Neutral ground disappeared quickly when fear entered the picture. The cowboy had a choice. He could mount his horse, ride away, and tell himself that this was not his concern. Many would have done exactly that. Life on the frontier was already hard enough without adding other people's problems. No one would blame him. No one would even know. But the cowboy had lived long enough to know that some moments stayed with a man forever. Turning away might keep him safe, but it would follow him in quiet hours, in the long nights when the stars watched and said nothing. He let out a slow breath and stepped closer. He knelt beside the injured man, careful not to startle him. The chief's eyes opened slightly, dark and steady even in weakness. There was no fear in them, only awareness. The cowboy raised his empty hands to show he meant no harm. Words were unnecessary. Respect traveled without language. The cowboy checked the man's condition as best he could. He had learned basic care from years on the trail: how to clean wounds, how to give water slowly, how to make someone comfortable enough to hold on. He worked quietly, using water from the stream and clean cloth from his saddlebag. The chief did not speak, but he watched everything. Every movement, every pause. Trust was not given easily, especially in a world where it was often broken. Still, he allowed the cowboy to help. That alone said something. Once the man was stable enough to move slightly, the cowboy looked around. This place was too open. Anyone passing by could see them. he decided they needed shelter somewhere hidden. Carefully, he helped the chief sit up and supported him as they moved toward a rocky outcrop nearby. It was slow, difficult work, but neither complained. Inside the shallow shelter formed by the rocks, the air was cooler. The cowboy made a small resting place and gave the chief more water. He kept watch, listening to the wind, the distant sounds of the land. Every shadow made him alert. Time passed quietly. The sun moved across the sky and the heat softened as evening approached. The chief rested, his breathing becoming steadier. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough, shaped by effort. The words were not clear, but the meaning was simple: gratitude. The cowboy nodded. He did not respond with long speeches. He had never been good at that. Instead, he offered food, simple and plain. The chief accepted, eating slowly. Two men from very different worlds sat together, sharing silence and simple kindness. As night came, the cowboy knew they could not stay long. Tracks could be found by morning. He gathered dry wood and made a small fire hidden as best as possible. The light was kept low. He took the first watch, sitting just outside the shelter, eyes scanning the darkness. His thoughts wandered. He wondered how the chief had ended up alone, what events had led to this moment. He knew enough about the tensions in the area to guess that power and fear were involved. Change was coming to the land, and not everyone agreed on what that change should look like. Despite the danger, the cowboy felt calm. He had made his choice, and for better or worse, he would see it through. Helping this man felt right in a way that could not be explained by logic alone. Before dawn, the chief stirred again. He seemed stronger now, still weak but alert. He gestured toward the east, then to the cowboy, as if asking a question. The cowboy understood enough to answer. He would help him reach safer ground. That decision marked the true beginning of everything that followed. Neither man could fully understand how far the consequences would reach. At that moment, there were only two travelers sharing the quiet before sunrise, bound together by a single act of compassion in a land where such acts were rare. The first light of morning touched the hills, and the cowboy stood, preparing to move. The open range waited, and with it, dangers yet unseen. But for now there was purpose, and that was enough to take the next step forward. Morning came slowly, as if the land itself was careful not to disturb what had begun. The cowboy helped the chief rise, supporting him with steady hands. Every step was measured. The chief's strength had returned only a little, and the journey ahead would not be easy. Still, there was a quiet determination in his eyes that told the cowboy this man had walked difficult paths before. They moved at a slow pace, following narrow ground where tracks would be harder to notice. The cowboy led the horse by the reins instead of riding it, allowing the chief to lean against the saddle when needed. They did not speak much. Words were limited, and silence felt safer. Yet in that silence, a kind of understanding began to form. As the sun climbed higher, the land changed around them. Open plains gave way to scattered trees and gentle slopes. The cowboy chose routes that offered shade and cover, showing his deep knowledge of the terrain. The chief watched carefully, taking in every decision. He could tell this man was not careless or driven by pride. That mattered. By midday, they stopped near a cluster of trees. The cowboy checked the chief's condition again, offering water and food. The chief accepted with a nod, then pointed to the cowboy's hands, rough and scarred from years of work. He spoke a few words in his own language, slow and thoughtful. The cowboy did not understand the exact meaning, but the tone was clear. It was respect. The cowboy replied with a small gesture of his own, touching his chest briefly and then motioning toward the land. It was his way of saying he belonged to the range, not to conflict. The chief studied him for a long moment, then gave a short, quiet smile. Something shifted between them after that. The help was no longer just survival. It was shared purpose. As they continued, signs of danger became clearer. Broken branches, faint marks on the ground, distant movement on the horizon. The cowboy noticed these things immediately. He knew others were searching. The chief noticed too, his posture tightening, his gaze scanning far beyond what the cowboy could see. They stopped again as evening approached, this time near a low ridge. The cowboy chose a spot where the wind would carry sound toward them. He prepared a simple camp, careful to leave no clear signs behind. The chief sat nearby, resting but alert. As the fire's faint warmth reached them, the chief began to speak more. He used simple words mixed with gestures, telling fragments of his story. He spoke of division among his people. Some wanted peace and slow change. Others wanted control and quick answers. He had stood in the middle, trying to guide without forcing. That had made him a target. The cowboy listened without interruption. He had seen similar struggles among settlers, families divided, towns split by ambition and fear. Power always brought trouble no matter who held it. He did not judge, he simply listened. The chief then asked a question carefully as if it mattered greatly. Why help him? The cowboy thought for a moment. Then he spoke slowly, choosing words that felt honest. He said he did not believe a man should be left behind when he could be helped. He said the land had taught him that everyone depended on one another, whether they admitted it or not. The chief nodded, absorbing this. He looked into the fire, then back at the cowboy. He spoke a single word that needed no translation: trust. That night the cowboy slept lightly. Every sound woke him. The chief rested more deeply now, his breathing steady. Somewhere in the distance an animal called out, then fell silent. The land held its breath. The next day brought more challenges. The chief struggled with pain, though he tried not to show it. The cowboy adjusted their pace, sometimes stopping just to let him gather strength. Patience was essential. Rushing would only lead to mistakes. At one point they reached a narrow crossing between hills. The cowboy hesitated. This place could be risky, but avoiding it would add days to their journey. He studied the ground, the wind, the sky. The chief watched him closely. Finally, the cowboy decided they would move through, but carefully. Halfway across, they heard distant sounds, voices carried faintly by the wind. The cowboy froze, signaling the chief to stay still. They waited, barely breathing. The voices passed without stopping, unaware of how close they had come. When the danger faded, the cowboy let out a slow breath. The chief placed a hand briefly on his arm. It was a small gesture, but full of meaning. By the third day, their alliance felt solid, even without many words. They shared food, watch duty, and quiet moments of rest. The cowboy learned to read the chief's expressions, to understand when he needed to stop or when he could go on. The chief, in turn, learned to trust the cowboy's instincts. As they moved closer to safer ground, the chief became more focused. He knew what awaited him: difficult conversations, decisions that could not be avoided. Yet he did not show fear. Instead, there was resolve. One afternoon, they reached a high point overlooking a wide valley. The chief stood there for a long time, taking it in. This land mattered to him deeply. The cowboy stayed back, giving him space. Some moments were not meant to be shared fully. When the chief turned back, he spoke again, more clearly now. He said that helping him would not go unnoticed. Not all would understand it, but some would. He warned the cowboy that once others knew what he had done, life might not be as simple as before. The cowboy accepted this quietly. He had already crossed that line. There was no going back. He said he was not looking for recognition. He only wanted to finish what he had started. As evening fell, they camped one last time before reaching the edge of the chief's territory. The air felt heavier, charged with what was coming next. The cowboy sensed that the most dangerous part might not be behind them after all. The chief sat close to the fire, his face calm but thoughtful. He looked at the cowboy and spoke slowly, carefully. He said that tomorrow others would see them together. Some would question it. Some would oppose it. He asked the cowboy if he was ready for that. The cowboy looked at the fire, then at the darkening sky. He thought of the quiet life he had lived, the freedom of moving on when things became complicated. He thought of the choice he had made by the stream. Then he met the chief's gaze. He said yes. The fire burned low as night settled in. Two men from different worlds sat side by side, aware that the path ahead would test everything they believed in. The alliance they had formed was fragile, built on trust rather than promises, yet it was strong enough to carry them forward. In the distance, unseen by either of them, movement stirred across the land. Others were watching, others were preparing. The journey was far from over, and the choices made next would shape more than just their own futures. The next morning felt different from the moment the cowboy opened his eyes. The air was still, too still, as if the land itself was waiting. He rose quietly and scanned the area before waking the chief. Nothing seemed out of place at first, yet his instincts told him they were no longer alone in this journey. They moved out early, keeping to low ground. The chief walked with more strength now, though each step still carried effort. His face was calm, but his eyes were alert, reading signs the cowboy could not always see. From time to time he paused and listened, then motioned for the cowboy to change direction slightly. It was clear that he sensed something approaching. By mid-morning, the signs became impossible to ignore. The cowboy noticed distant movement on the ridges far away. At first, it looked like shadows shifting with the clouds. Then he saw it clearly, figures small and scattered but moving with purpose. They were not traveling randomly. They were searching. The cowboy stopped and crouched low, signaling the chief. They watched together. The chief's expression hardened, not with fear but with understanding. He had expected this. Word traveled fast across the land, especially when power and leadership were involved. The cowboy felt a weight settle in his chest. He had known this moment would come, but seeing it made everything real. This was no longer just about helping someone recover. Others were closing in and their intentions were uncertain. Some might want answers, others might want control. Either way, being found together would change everything. They altered their route again, heading toward a rocky area where the land rose and fell sharply. It was harder to travel but offered more cover. The cowboy led carefully, choosing each step. He could feel eyes on them even when he saw no one. As the hours passed, the sense of being watched grew stronger. At times, faint signals appeared in the distance, brief flashes of movement, shapes appearing and disappearing. The chief explained quietly, using simple words and gestures that many were looking for him. Not all wished him harm, but all wished to find him. By afternoon, the cowboy realized how large the search had become. This was not a small group. This was organized, determined, and growing. He counted movements on different ridges, far apart yet connected. His heart sank. There were far more than he had imagined. The chief stopped near a narrow pass between rock walls. He studied it for a long time. This place could slow those following them, but it could also trap them. The cowboy waited, trusting the chief's judgment now as much as his own. Finally, the chief nodded. They moved into the pass. The space was tight, forcing them to walk single file. Sound echoed easily here, so they moved slowly, carefully. The cowboy felt every scrape of boot against stone, every breath sounding too loud. When they reached a wider area inside, they paused to rest. It was there that the cowboy understood the full truth. From a high ledge, he could see the land behind them clearly. Spread across the distance were many figures, far more than he could count quickly. They were closing in from different directions, guiding one another with signals the cowboy barely noticed. There were hundreds. The cowboy swallowed hard. He had faced danger before, storms, wild animals, desperate men, but never anything like this. This was not a single threat. This was a force, moving with shared purpose. Against that, two men had little chance if things went wrong. He turned to the chief, expecting worry or regret. Instead, the chief stood tall, his shoulders straight. He looked not defeated but resolved. He spoke calmly, explaining that these were warriors from many groups. Some followed tradition. Others followed ambition. All would soon see the truth with their own eyes. The cowboy asked if there was another way out. The chief shook his head. Running now would only increase suspicion. It would turn questions into certainty. He said they must stand not with challenge but with openness. The cowboy felt fear rise, but he pushed it down. He had come too far to turn away now. He nodded. They moved out of the pass and into an open area where they could be clearly seen. The chief walked forward first, steady and proud. The cowboy followed, staying close but not ahead. He understood that his role here was not to lead but to support. As they emerged, the land seemed to hold its breath. From every direction, figures appeared, on hills, between rocks, along distant paths. They stopped at a distance at first, watching. The silence was heavy, filled with unspoken tension. The cowboy's heart pounded. He forced himself to stand still, hands open, posture calm. Any sudden movement could be misunderstood. He reminded himself to breathe. The chief raised one hand slowly, a gesture of recognition and peace. He spoke clearly, his voice carrying across the space. Though the cowboy did not understand every word, he understood the meaning. The chief was explaining who he was, why he stood there, and why the cowboy was beside him. Some of the figures stepped closer. Others stayed back. The air buzzed with emotion, confusion, anger, relief, and curiosity all mixed together. The cowboy could feel many eyes on him, measuring him, judging him. A few voices rose, sharp and questioning. The chief answered calmly, never raising his voice. He spoke of unity, of choices made for the good of all. He spoke of survival, not control. He spoke of trust. Time stretched. The cowboy's legs ached from standing still, but he did not move. He noticed elders among the group, their faces thoughtful. They watched more than they spoke. That gave him a small sense of hope. One man stepped forward, clearly respected by others. He looked at the chief, then at the cowboy. He asked a question that needed no translation. Why was an outsider here? The chief turned slightly and gestured toward the cowboy. He told the story simply, how he had been found, helped, and protected when he could not protect himself. He made it clear that no demand had been made, no reward promised. The help had been freely given. A murmur moved through the crowd. Some faces softened. Others remained hard. The cowboy felt the weight of the moment press down on him. He realized that his actions, which had seemed small and personal at the time, were now being judged on a much larger stage. This was no longer just about him or the chief. It was about what kind of world they wanted to live in. He stepped forward slightly, just enough to be seen clearly. He did not speak loudly. He did not speak long. He said he had helped because it was the right thing to do. He said he had no interest in taking sides or causing trouble. He respected the land and the people who lived on it. Silence followed his words. Then one of the elders nodded slowly. Another did the same. It was not a decision, but it was a shift. The tension eased just a little. Still, the danger was not gone. Too many people, too many emotions. The cowboy could feel how easily the balance could tip. The chief seemed to sense it too. He spoke again, this time calling for patience. He asked that no action be taken until all voices were heard. Gradually, the group began to settle. Some sat. Some turned to speak quietly with one another. The circle that had felt like a trap began to feel more like a gathering. The cowboy let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. As the sun lowered, long shadows stretched across the ground. The chief was offered water and a place to sit. He accepted, but he did not let the cowboy move far from his side. That gesture did not go unnoticed. The cowboy understood now that the greatest threat had not been the number of warriors, but fear itself. Fear of loss, fear of change, fear of betrayal. Standing openly had not removed those fears, but it had stopped them from taking control. Yet he also knew this was not the end. Decisions would be made. Paths would be chosen. Some would agree, others would not. The calm they had reached was fragile, like thin ice over deep water. As night approached, fires were lit at a distance. The group did not leave, but neither did they advance. It was an unspoken agreement to pause. The cowboy sat beside the chief, exhausted but steady. He looked up at the darkening sky and wondered how his life had brought him here. He had set out as a man who avoided notice, who passed through places without leaving marks. Now, without meaning to, he stood at the center of something far larger. The chief spoke softly, thanking him again, not just for the help but for the courage to stand when it mattered. The cowboy nodded, unsure how to respond. He did not feel brave. He felt human. Around them hundreds remained, watching, waiting. The night wrapped around the land, holding every question in silence. Whatever came next would shape not only the chief's future, but the cowboy's as well. And somewhere deep inside, the cowboy knew that turning back was no longer possible. Night settled slowly over the land, wrapping the gathered people in a deep, quiet stillness. Small fires burned at a distance, their light soft and controlled. No one moved too close and no one moved away. It was not a standoff, but it was not peace either. It was a pause, fragile and uncertain. The cowboy sat on the ground beside the chief, his back straight, his eyes alert. He could feel the presence of many people around them even when he could not see them clearly. Every sound carried, the crackle of firewood, the shift of feet, the low murmur of voices speaking carefully. The land seemed to listen along with them. The chief rested, but he did not sleep. His gaze moved slowly across the gathering, recognizing faces, reading expressions. Some showed relief at seeing him alive. Others showed doubt. A few showed clear frustration. He understood all of it. Leadership had taught him that not everyone would walk the same path, even when the destination was shared. The cowboy wondered what these people saw when they looked at him. To some, he was an outsider who did not belong here. To others, he was a symbol of something unexpected. He kept his posture open, his hands visible, reminding himself that calm could be felt even without words. As the hours passed, elders began to move closer. They sat in a wide circle, not surrounding but including. The chief was invited to speak. He rose slowly, supported by his own strength now more than the cowboy's help. The gathering quieted even more. He spoke with care, choosing words meant to heal rather than divide. He spoke of the land, of responsibility, of the danger of acting from fear alone. He spoke of how easily misunderstanding could turn neighbors into enemies. His voice was steady, not demanding attention but earning it. He told them how he had been injured, how he had been left alone, and how help had come from a place he did not expect. He did not exaggerate. He did not hide the truth. He explained that the cowboy had asked for nothing, had made no demands, had simply helped because it was right. Some in the group shifted uncomfortably. Others nodded. A few lowered their eyes. When the chief finished, there was silence. Then one elder spoke, his voice calm but firm. He said the times were changing fast. Trust was harder to give than ever. He asked how they could be sure this help carried no hidden purpose. The chief listened fully before responding. He said certainty was rare in any time. But choices still had to be made. He said trust did not begin with guarantees but with courage. He said turning away from kindness only strengthened fear. The cowboy felt the weight of those words. He realized they were not only meant for the gathering but for him as well. He had acted without knowing the outcome. Now he was living inside the result. Another voice spoke, sharper than the rest. This one questioned why the chief had allowed himself to be seen as weak. The air tightened again. The cowboy's muscles tensed, but he stayed still. The chief answered without anger. He said strength was not about never falling, but about how one rose afterward. He said surviving alone proved nothing, but surviving together proved everything. That answer shifted something. The sharp voice did not reply. Slowly, discussion replaced tension. People spoke in turns. Disagreements were voiced but not shouted. The presence of elders kept the balance. The cowboy watched closely, amazed at how quickly things could fall apart and how carefully they could be held together. At one point, the chief invited the cowboy to speak again. The cowboy hesitated. Every eye turned toward him. He stood, feeling the weight of his boots against the ground. He spoke simply. He said he had lived his life moving from place to place, trying not to cause harm. He said he had learned that land remembered how people treated it, and so did people. He said helping the chief had not been a plan. It had been a moment. And moments, he believed, were what shaped a man's character. He ended by saying he did not expect trust, only understanding. The circle remained quiet after that. Then one elder stood and approached the cowboy. He studied him carefully, then placed a hand over his own chest in a gesture of respect. Others followed. Not all, but enough. The tension did not vanish, but it softened. The idea of immediate action faded. Instead, the group agreed to wait until morning to allow cooler heads to guide decisions. Fires were rearranged. Food was shared. The circle loosened. The cowboy sat again, his legs weak with relief. The chief gave him a small nod. It was not celebration, but it was progress. As the night deepened, the cowboy finally allowed himself to rest, though sleep came lightly. Dreams mixed with distant sounds and shifting shadows. Each time he stirred, the chief was still awake, watching the stars. Just before dawn, a light wind moved through the camp. The sky slowly brightened. With the morning came clarity and new challenges. People gathered again, larger now, more organized. Messengers had come and gone during the night. News traveled quickly. Expectations rose with the sun. The chief stood once more. This time he spoke of the future. He said there would need to be talks, agreements, and patience. He said no single day could fix what years had strained. He asked for time. Some accepted this. Others did not. A group stepped forward, voices tense. They argued that waiting meant weakness, that showing restraint would invite loss. The cowboy felt the balance shift again, dangerously. The chief listened. Then he did something unexpected. He stepped aside slightly and gestured to the cowboy, placing him in clear view of everyone. He said this man had risked his life without promise or reward. He said if someone like that could choose compassion over safety, then surely they could choose discussion over division. The group fell silent. The cowboy felt exposed, but he did not step back. He met their gazes calmly, one by one. He did not challenge them. He did not plead. He simply stood. After a long moment, one of the louder voices lowered. Another turned away, thoughtful. The push toward conflict slowed, then stopped. It was not victory, but it was restraint. By midday, the decision was made to let the chief return fully and speak with all sides in the days ahead. No immediate action would be taken. The gathering would break peacefully. As people began to disperse, some approached the cowboy quietly. A nod, a word of thanks, a look of curiosity, not everyone but enough. The chief turned to him, his expression serious. He said the danger was not completely gone. Some would not forget this moment. The cowboy understood. They stood together as the land returned to its usual rhythm. The crisis had passed, but the impact remained. The cowboy knew one thing clearly now. He was no longer just a traveler passing through. His choice had tied him to this place, these people, and the path ahead, whether he wanted it or not. And as the wind moved across the open ground, carrying away the last echoes of tension, he realized that sometimes standing still took more courage than running ever could. The land felt quieter after everything that had happened, as if it were slowly settling back into itself. People moved away in small groups, heading toward their own paths, their voices low and thoughtful. The wide space that had once held so many now felt open again, but not empty. Something had changed, and everyone could feel it. The cowboy stood beside the chief for a long moment, watching the figures disappear into the distance. He felt tired in a way that went deeper than his body. It was the kind of tiredness that came from carrying responsibility, even briefly. He had never planned to be part of something like this. Yet here he was, standing at the end of a turning point. The chief spoke quietly, thanking him again. not with grand words but with honesty. He said that help given at the right moment could echo far beyond that moment. The cowboy nodded. He did not fully know how to accept such words. He had acted because it felt right, not because he wanted meaning attached to it. They walked together toward a small rise where the chief's people waited. As they approached, some stepped forward respectfully. Others watched from a distance. Trust did not arrive all at once, but it had begun to grow, and that mattered. When they reached the edge of the group, the chief turned to the cowboy. He said their paths would soon separate. The work ahead required the chief to stay, to speak, to guide, and sometimes to stand alone again. He said the cowboy was free to return to his own life. The cowboy felt a pause inside himself. He had imagined leaving, riding back into the open range, letting the wind erase his tracks. That life had always suited him, but now it felt different. Not wrong, just changed. He said he would stay a little longer, long enough to be sure the chief was safe. Long enough to see that the calm held. The chief accepted this with a nod. He did not push. He understood that some choices needed space. Over the next few days, the land filled with voices again, but this time they were calmer. Conversations replaced tension. Elders met with leaders from different groups. Disagreements remained, but they were spoken instead of hidden. The cowboy stayed mostly on the edge of things, observing, helping where he could, never placing himself at the center. People began to greet him differently. No longer just as an outsider, but as someone who had stood firm when it mattered. Children watched him with curiosity. Older ones studied him with quiet respect. He did not change how he acted. He remained steady, simple, and kind. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in soft colors, the chief sat with the cowboy near a small fire. He spoke of the future, not with certainty but with hope. He said the path ahead would still be difficult. Change always was. But the gathering had shown that restraint was possible, that unity did not require everyone to think the same way. The cowboy listened, poking the fire gently with a stick. He thought about how close everything had come to breaking, how easily fear could have taken control. He realized that sometimes the greatest difference was made not by force, but by someone choosing not to step away. When the time came for him to leave, there was no ceremony, just a few quiet goodbyes. The chief placed a hand on his shoulder and said that the land would remember what he had done. The cowboy did not know if that was true, but he appreciated the thought. He mounted his horse at first light. The animal shifted beneath him, eager to move. As he rode away, he did not look back right away. When he finally did, the figures were small against the vast land, already becoming part of the distance. The open range welcomed him again. The familiar rhythm of travel returned, hoofbeats, wind, long stretches of silence. Yet the silence felt different now. It carried memory. As days turned into weeks, the story of what had happened traveled farther than the cowboy did. It moved through spoken words, shared quietly around fires, passed from one person to another. Each telling changed slightly, but the heart of it remained the same, a moment when someone chose compassion over fear. The cowboy heard parts of the story in towns he passed through. Sometimes he recognized himself. Sometimes he did not. He never corrected anyone. He did not claim the story. He let it live on its own. His life returned to simple work, guiding cattle, fixing fences, sleeping under the stars. Yet people treated him differently now. Some asked questions. Others simply nodded with understanding. He learned that once a man acted in a way that touched many lives, he never truly walked unseen again. There were moments when he wondered what might have happened if he had made a different choice by the stream, if he had ridden on. Life would have been quieter, simpler. But it would not have been the same. Years later, long after the details had faded, the core of the story remained. Elders told of a time when a leader was helped by someone from outside, and how that moment slowed the rush toward division. They spoke of how calm words and steady presence had held back a storm. The cowboy grew older, his movements slower. his hair touched by time. He still rode when he could, still listened more than he spoke. Sometimes, when the land was very quiet, he thought about that day and the many that followed. He did not regret his choice. In the end, there was no statue, no written record that fully captured what had happened, just memory carried by people and place. And perhaps that was enough, because sometimes the most important stories are not about being remembered forever, but about making one moment better than it could have been. And in that moment, long ago, one man had chosen to stand.